Inside a captured German research facility in June 1945, Allied officers watched as enemy scientists flipped through intelligence files with trembling hands, their faces going pale as they read report after report about Australian war technology they never knew existed. One German engineer finally looked up and said the words that would shock the room into silence. "This is impossible. Australia was supposed to be a farming nation." How did a country of just 7 million people, dismissed as a colonial backwater, secretly build a war science program so massive that it left the world's top scientists speechless? The war in Europe had ended just 3 weeks earlier when British intelligence officer Major Harold Perkins arrived at the Falcon Road Aeronautical Research Center in Germany. British intelligence officer Major Harold Perkins stood in a concrete building that smelled of burned paper and machine oil. German scientists had tried to destroy their files before the Allies arrived, but they had run out of time. Smoke still hung in the air from the half-burned documents scattered across the floor. Perkins and his team had one job: gather every scrap of German scientific knowledge before the Soviet troops arrived from the east. They had maybe 48 hours. The building was cold despite the summer heat outside. Its thick walls had kept the research rooms cool during the war, perfect for precise scientific work. Now, those same walls made the place feel like a tomb. Perkins walked past tables covered with complex drawings of aircraft wings and engine parts. He passed shelves holding models of planes. Some he recognized, others he had never seen before. The Germans had been busy right up until the end. In the main research hall, Perkins found what he was looking for. Filing cabinets lined an entire wall, each one stuffed with folders. These were not technical drawings or test results. These were intelligence reports. The Germans had been watching the Allies, trying to understand what the other side was building, what they were inventing, where their scientific strength really lay. Perkins pulled out folder after folder, reports on American aircraft production, notes about British radar systems, charts showing Soviet tank manufacturing. The Germans had tracked it all. Then Perkins found something strange. A thin folder marked simply Australia, Technical Assessment, 1939-1944. He expected maybe 10 pages. When he opened it, he found more than 200 documents inside. His hands stopped moving. Why would the Germans care so much about Australia? The folder felt heavy in his hands. He spread the first documents on a table. A report from 1939 caught his eye. A German analyst had written, "Commonwealth member Australia maintains minimal industrial capacity. Population of 7 million dispersed across vast distances. Scientific establishment adequate for agricultural studies only. Technical threat negligible." Perkins almost laughed. That matched what everyone thought about Australia before the war. A farming nation, lots of sheep and wheat, not a place where serious science happened. But the next document made him stop laughing. Dated April 1943, the report's tone had completely changed. Australian munitions output exceeds preliminary estimates by factor of 12. Source of optical instruments requires immediate investigation. Apparent domestic radar production contradicts previous assessments. Perkins flipped through more pages. Each report showed German confusion growing and growing. By 1944, the intelligence files contained words like unexpected, unaccounted, and requires explanation on almost every page. Perkins called over his team. They spent the next 6 hours reading through the Australian folder. The picture that emerged made no sense. According to German intelligence, Australia had somehow built thousands, of radar sets when the Germans thought they had almost none. Australia had produced over 1 million precision optical instruments when Germany controlled 85% of the world's optical manufacturing before the war. Australia had designed and built aircraft, designed new weapons, created new medical supplies, all at a scale the Germans never predicted. The most striking document came from late 1944. A German naval intelligence officer had written a report about Australian acoustic mines. These were special underwater bombs that listened for ship engines and exploded when they heard the right sound. The German officer wrote, "Acoustic mine technology recovered from Pacific theater shows sophisticated frequency discrimination beyond assessed Australian technical capacity." Previous intelligence regarding Commonwealth scientific limitations requires complete revision. Perkins sat back in his chair. He had spent 3 years of the war tracking German technology. He knew how good German scientists were. They had invented jet engines, guided missiles, and countless other weapons that pushed the edge of what seemed possible. Germany had employed more than 5,700 aerospace engineers alone. Their scientific establishment was massive, organized, and well-funded. If these scientists were shocked by what Australia had done, then something remarkable had happened. The next morning, Perkins interviewed some of the German scientists who had worked at the facility. Most were eager to talk, hoping cooperation might help them avoid prison. One scientist, Dr. Friedrich Weber, had specialized in tracking Allied technical capabilities. Perkins showed him the Australian folder. Weber nodded slowly. "Yes, the Australian problem. We could never solve it. The mathematics did not work." Perkins asked what he meant. Weber explained that German intelligence had calculated how many scientists, engineers, and factories each Allied nation could support based on their population and industrial base. The numbers worked for America, Britain, Canada, even India, but Australia's output kept exceeding what the calculations said was possible. "We thought perhaps your intelligence was feeding us false information," Weber said, "making Australia look stronger to deceive us, but then we captured some Australian equipment. It was real. All of it was real." Weber pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. Inside were his own notes, separate from the official reports. "I became fascinated by this puzzle," he said. "A nation of 7 million people, isolated, far from the main war, with limited industrial tradition. Yet by 1943, they had mobilized 31% of their entire workforce into war production. 31%. That is the highest ratio of any nation in the war. Higher than Germany, higher than Britain, higher than the Soviet Union." Perkins wrote down the number. 31%. That meant nearly 1 in 3 Australians had been building weapons, equipment, and supplies for the war. In a country where most people had been farmers just a few years before. Weber continued, "We kept asking ourselves, how is this possible? What did we miss? What did they do that we did not see?" The answer to those questions lay in the story of one man who almost everyone had dismissed. Back in 1939, when the war was just beginning, British officials in London had met with Dr. David Rivett. Rivett was the chief executive of Australia's Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, called CSIR. The British officials were polite but clear. They saw Australia as a place that could help with farming research, maybe some basic mineral studies. One official had written in his notes, "Adequate capacity for agricultural studies only." When Rivet suggested that Australia could contribute to weapons research and advanced manufacturing, the British officials smiled and changed the subject. Rivet returned to Australia angry but determined. He understood something the British officials did not. Australia's isolation and small size were not weaknesses. They could become strengths if approached the right way. He had an insight that would change everything. Instead of trying to build one or two big research centers like the Europeans did, Australia would turn the entire nation into a network of small, flexible research sites. Every university, every factory, every workshop with skilled workers could become a node in a giant distributed science program. Rivet believed that practical innovation, the kind born from necessity and limited resources, could match or even exceed the theoretical work done in the grand European laboratories. But in 1939, almost no one believed him. The Germans certainly did not. Their assessment was clear. Australia posed a negligible technological threat. Within 5 years, those same German scientists would be struggling to understand how they had been so completely wrong. How had the supposed colonial backwater managed to surprise the most advanced scientific establishment in Europe? The answer would reveal something profound about the nature of innovation itself. David Rivet stood in his office in Melbourne, staring at a map of Australia on the wall. It was October 1939, and the war had just begun. He had returned from London with almost no support and even less respect from the British scientific establishment. But Rivet had spent his whole career solving problems that seemed impossible, and he had learned one important truth. When you lack resources, you have to be creative. Australia did not have huge factories or thousands of trained scientists like Germany did. What Australia had was something different. It had people who knew how to fix things, how to make things work with whatever materials they could find. Rivet's plan was simple in concept, but radical in practice. He would turn that practical skill into a weapon. The first challenge came immediately. Britain needed optical instruments desperately. Binoculars, rangefinders, gun sights, these tools helped soldiers see enemy positions and aim weapons accurately. Before the war, Germany had produced 85% of the world's precision optical equipment. German factories in places like Jena had centuries of experience grinding lenses to exact specifications. When the war started, Britain suddenly had almost no source for these critical instruments. Rivet saw an opportunity. Australia would learn to make them. The problem seemed impossible. Precision optics required incredibly exact measurements. Lenses had to be ground to tolerances of less than 1,000th of a millimeter. The glass had to be perfectly pure. The coatings had to be applied in specific thicknesses. Australia had never made anything like this before. The country had exactly 0 factories that produced optical munitions in 1939. 0. Rivet did not care. He gathered the best glass workers, camera makers, and telescope builders he could find. He brought in physics professors from universities. He found skilled craftsmen who had worked with lenses in other industries. Within 6 months, he had them all working together in small workshops scattered across Melbourne and Sydney. The early attempts failed spectacularly. The first binoculars came out blurry, or rangefinders gave wrong distances. Gun sights could not hold their adjustments. Every failure taught the teams something new. Rivet insisted they share what they learned. When a workshop in Melbourne discovered a better way to grind lenses, they sent detailed instructions to Sydney the next day. When a team in Sydney found a new coating mixture that worked better, Melbourne had the formula within a week. Slowly, painfully, the Australian teams learned to make optical instruments that actually worked. By 1941, Australian workshops were producing 20,000 binoculars per month. By 1942, that number had doubled. By the end of the war, Australia had manufactured 1.2 million precision optical instruments. British officers who had dismissed Australian capabilities just 3 years earlier now depended on Australian-made rangefinders and gun sights. German intelligence analysts noted the optical instrument production in their reports, but struggled to explain where Australia had found the expertise. The next test came from the jungle. Australian soldiers fighting in New Guinea needed a reliable submachine gun. The British had offered the Sten gun, a simple weapon that was cheap to make. But in the tropical heat and constant rain of the New Guinea jungle, the Sten gun jammed constantly. Australian soldier Evelyn Owen had designed a different kind of submachine gun. His design looked strange. The magazine fed from the top instead of the side. The barrel could be removed quickly for cleaning. Everything about it seemed unorthodox. When Owen brought his design to the British War Office in 1940, officials rejected it immediately. One officer wrote, "Design is crude and unorthodox, does not meet standard specifications." The officials wanted weapons that looked like proper European firearms. Owen's gun looked like something built in a garage, probably because it had been. Rivet heard about the rejection and saw something the British had missed. Owen's design was different because it solved different problems. European guns were designed for European weather. Owen's gun was designed for tropical warfare. General Thomas Blamey commanded Australian forces in New Guinea. He had watched too many soldiers die because their weapons jammed at critical moments. Blamey demanded field trials. Take the Sten gun and the Owen gun into the jungle. Test them in real conditions. The tests were brutal. Both guns were dropped in mud. Both were soaked in water. Both were left in humid air for days. Then soldiers tried to fire them. The Sten gun jammed after a few shots. The Owen gun kept firing. More tests followed. The Owen gun proved 87% more reliable than the Sten gun in tropical conditions. Blamey ordered immediate production. Australian factories built 45,000 Owen guns during the war. Soldiers loved them. The weapon became famous across the Pacific Theater. German intelligence officers who examined, captured Owen guns noted their unusual design and reliable performance. One report stated, "Australian infantry weapon shows practical design approach, prioritizing function over convention, significantly more effective in tropical environment than standard Allied submachine guns." But Rivet's most ambitious project involved radar. Radar was the secret weapon that had helped Britain survive the German air attacks in 1940. Radio waves bounced off aircraft, showing their location on a screen. The technology was new and incredibly complex. Britain had spent years developing radar with some of the best scientists in the world. When the war expanded to the Pacific, Britain needed radar stations across Australia and the islands to the north. The British plan was simple. They would send radar sets from Britain, and Australians would operate them. Australians would have observational duties only. Rivet refused to accept that limitation. He wanted Australia to build its own radar. British officials thought this was absurd. Radar required advanced electronics, precise manufacturing, and deep theoretical knowledge. Even with years of experience, British factories struggled to make enough radar sets. How could Australia possibly build them from scratch? Rivet argued that Australia needed to try. Supply lines from Britain to Australia were long and dangerous. Japanese submarines hunted the shipping routes. If Australia depended entirely on British radar and the supply was cut off, the whole continent would be blind. The British eventually agreed to send 2 radar prototypes to Australia just as examples. Rivet's teams tore them apart to understand how they worked. They studied every component. They measured every dimension. They tested every circuit. Then they began redesigning. Australian factories could not make exact copies of British radar. They did not have the same materials or tools. So the teams designed new versions that used what Australia could produce. They simplified some parts. They strengthened others. They created radar sets that worked in Australian conditions, in the tropical heat, in the dust, in locations far from any maintenance facilities. The results shocked everyone. Between 1940 and 1945, Australian teams designed 14 different types of radar. 14 completely different systems, each one adapted for specific needs. Some were for ships, some were for aircraft, some were for coastal defense. Australia did not just copy British radar. Australia created an entire radar industry. By the war's end, Australian factories had built more than 2,000 radar sets. The British had expected Australia to operate maybe 20 imported systems. Instead, Australia became one of the largest radar producers in the world. The scale of production grew beyond anything the pre-war estimates had predicted. Rivet had organized 373 facilities across Australia by 1943. Universities ran research programs. Factories built components. Small workshops assembled finished products. The whole system worked like a living organism, each part supporting the others. When one facility discovered an improvement, the information spread to all the others within days. When supplies ran short, teams found substitutes or created new manufacturing methods. The distributed network that Rivet had envisioned was working exactly as he had hoped. German intelligence continued to track Australian production with growing confusion. Their analysts could not understand where Australia found the engineers, the scientists, the skilled workers to do all this. The numbers kept exceeding German calculations. One report from 1943 noted, Australian technical output suggests industrial base at least 3 times larger than assessed. Alternatively, productivity per worker significantly exceeds observed rates in comparable Allied nations. Neither explanation fully accounts for observed capabilities. The Germans were trying to solve a puzzle that did not make sense according to their assumptions. They thought industrial capacity came from huge factories and large populations. They did not understand that Rivet had found a different path, one based on flexibility, creativity, and making the most of limited resources. The full scale of Australian innovation was about to become even more apparent. By 1943, the transformation of Australia was complete and utterly remarkable. In just 4 years, the nation had gone from having 2% of its workforce in war manufacturing to 31%. That meant 850,000 Australians were directly employed building weapons, equipment, and supplies. To understand how stunning this was, consider that 1 in every 5 Australian citizens was now working in a munitions factory, a research lab, or a production facility. No other Allied nation achieved this level of mobilization. Not America with its massive industrial base, not Britain fighting for survival, not even the Soviet Union under total war conditions. Australia, the farming nation that German intelligence had dismissed as a negligible threat, had achieved the highest mobilization ratio in the entire war. The numbers told a story that seemed impossible. Australian factories and workshops had produced 217 major innovations by the war's end. These were not minor improvements. These were entirely new inventions that earned official patents. Proximity fuses that made artillery shells explode at exactly the right height above the ground. New treatments for tropical diseases that saved thousands of lives. Advanced communication equipment that worked in conditions where other systems failed. Manufacturing processes that let small workshops produce complex parts that normally required huge factories. Each innovation came from the distributed network that Rivet had created, from teams working in universities, factories, and workshops scattered across the continent. Aircraft production showed the scale most clearly. Before the war, Australia had built a handful of training planes. Nothing combat-ready, nothing sophisticated. By the war's end, Australian factories had produced aircraft of 1,591 different types. Not 1,591 total planes. 1,591 different variations and models. The Wirraway trainer that could also fight in emergencies. The Boomerang fighter designed specifically for low-altitude combat in the Pacific. The Beaufort bomber built under license but modified with Australian improvements. Transport planes, patrol planes, training aircraft. The total came to thousands of finished planes, all built in a country that German analysts thought could barely maintain imported equipment. Vehicle production matched the aircraft numbers. 66,000 land vehicles rolled out of Australian factories. Trucks, jeeps, armored cars, specialized transport vehicles for jungle terrain. Australian engineers designed many of these vehicles from scratch, adapting them for Pacific conditions. Standard military trucks often broke down in the mud and heat. Australian versions had better cooling systems, stronger suspensions, and parts that could be maintained with basic tools in remote jungle bases. Then there was the synthetic rubber breakthrough. Japan had captured the natural rubber plantations in Southeast Asia early in the war. Suddenly, the Allies faced a critical shortage. Rubber was essential for everything from vehicle tires to waterproof equipment. Australia needed rubber desperately but had no natural supply. So Australian chemists figured out how to make it artificially. By 1944, Australian factories were producing 8,500 tons of synthetic rubber every month. This was chemistry that required precise control of complex reactions, exactly the kind of advanced industrial work that pre-war assessments said Australia could not do. The British Ministry of Supply watched all this with mixed feelings. On one hand, Australian production was helping win the war. On the other hand, the Australians kept ignoring British instructions. In 1942, British officials had suggested that Australia should focus on simpler components and leave the complex manufacturing to Britain. Prime Minister John Curtin rejected the suggestion flatly. Australia would build whatever Australia needed to build. The country's survival might depend on it. If the supply lines from Britain were cut, Australia had to be self-sufficient. Curtin backed Rivet completely, giving him authority to organize production however he thought best. The most dramatic impact came from a weapon that almost nobody saw. Australian engineers had designed a new type of acoustic mine for underwater warfare. These mines sat on the ocean floor and listened. When they heard the sound of a ship's engine, they calculated the direction and distance. If the sound matched the pattern of an enemy ship, the mine exploded. The technology was sophisticated, requiring sensitive microphones, waterproof electronics, and complex circuits that could distinguish between different engine types. German naval intelligence had assumed such weapons were beyond Australian capability. They were wrong. Australian acoustic mines sank 83 Japanese vessels during the war. 83 ships sent to the bottom by technology that German analysts thought Australia could not build. A German naval report from 1944 described the captured mine components with a tone of frustration. Acoustic. Mine technology recovered from Pacific Theater shows sophisticated frequency discrimination beyond assessed Australian technical capacity. Circuit design indicates advanced understanding of signal processing. Underwater pressure housing demonstrates precision manufacturing capability not previously attributed to Commonwealth Pacific forces. The report revealed something important. The Germans were not just surprised by what Australia built, they were surprised by how well it was built. The acoustic mines worked reliably in ocean conditions. The circuits did not fail. The housings did not leak. This was not crude improvisation. This was high-quality engineering executed at scale. To understand what this all looked like in practice, imagine Port Moresby in July 1943. The city was a critical base for Allied operations in New Guinea. Walk through the military facilities there, and you would have seen Australian technology everywhere. Overhead, the distinctive sound of Wirraway aircraft engines, planes designed and built in Melbourne. On the ground, radio operators using Australian-designed frequency-hopping communication sets that made it harder for Japanese forces to jam signals. In the medical tents, doctors injecting soldiers with Australian-produced penicillin. Australia was making 5 million doses of penicillin by the war's end, using new mass production methods that Australian researchers had developed. American pharmaceutical companies would adopt those Australian methods in 1944 because they worked better than existing techniques. The heat in Port Moresby was brutal. The humidity made metal equipment rust. Overnight, standard military supplies often rotted or failed within weeks. But the Australian equipment kept working because it had been designed for these exact conditions. The radar sets tracking Japanese aircraft had been built to handle tropical moisture. The weapons had been tested in jungle conditions. The medical supplies used packaging that survived the heat. Every detail reflected practical experience, the kind of knowledge that came from actually fighting in the Pacific rather than designing equipment in comfortable European laboratories. German prisoners of war captured in North Africa later ended up in Australian camps. Some were scientists and engineers who had worked on weapons programs. One engineer, captured in 1943 and held near Melbourne, watched Australian trucks drive past the camp every day. He later told interrogators the factories visible from the camp were not particularly large, yet thousands of trucks kept rolling out day after day. The factories he could see from the camp were not particularly large. They did not look like the massive industrial complexes in Germany, yet the trucks kept coming day after day, thousands of them. The answer lay in Rivet's distributed system. No single factory had to be enormous because hundreds of smaller facilities were all working together. One workshop made engines, another made chassis. A third assembled them. Parts came from dozens of suppliers. The system was flexible and resilient. If one facility was damaged or had supply problems, others could pick up the slack. This was completely different from German manufacturing, which relied on huge centralized factories that produced everything in one place. The German approach was efficient in peacetime, but vulnerable to disruption. The Australian approach looked chaotic but proved remarkably tough. By late 1944, German intelligence had given up trying to explain Australian production with their existing models. One analyst wrote in a report, "Standard calculation methods fail to account for observed Australian industrial output. Either population figures are incorrect, or productivity rates exceed theoretical maximums, or intelligence regarding pre-war industrial capacity was fundamentally flawed. Recommend complete reassessment of Commonwealth industrial potential." The analyst was groping toward the truth, but could not quite grasp it. German thinking assumed that industrial capacity was a fixed thing, determined by population size and number of factories. Rivet had shown that capacity was actually flexible, determined by organization and innovation. The unexpected applications of Australian research kept appearing throughout the war. Synthetic rubber techniques led to new waterproofing methods. Optical instrument production created expertise that improved medical equipment. Radar research generated better radio communication systems. Each breakthrough connected to others, creating a web of innovation that kept expanding. Australian researchers had discovered something powerful. When you force people to solve immediate practical problems with limited resources, they often find solutions that work better than elaborate theoretical approaches. The final measure of scale came in the total production numbers. By the war's end, Australia had manufactured enough military equipment to supply its own forces completely and to provide significant support to American operations in the Pacific. Australian factories were producing aircraft, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, radar sets, radio equipment, medical supplies, uniforms, boots, and countless other items. The total economic mobilization reached levels that shocked everyone who studied it carefully. The nation of 7 million had punched far above its weight, achieving industrial output that should have required a population 3 times larger according to pre-war assumptions. German scientists examining all this evidence in 1945 found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. They had been wrong about Australia from the very beginning. Completely, fundamentally wrong. Their assessments of what was possible, their calculations of industrial capacity, their assumptions about scientific capability, all of it had failed to predict what actually happened. Standing in that research center in Falcon Road, reading through the intelligence reports, they had to confront the fact that their highly educated, well-funded, scientifically sophisticated establishment had been completely blindsided by a nation they had dismissed as insignificant. How had this happened? What had they missed? The answers to those questions would reshape how people thought about innovation and national capability for decades to come. When the last shots were fired in August 1945, the German scientists finally had their answer to the puzzle that had haunted their intelligence reports for years. But understanding how Australia had surprised them was only the beginning of a longer story. Rivet had built something that would outlast the emergency that created it. In 1949, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research transformed into the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, known as CSIRO. The new organization took the wartime lessons and applied them to peacetime challenges. The distributed network of research facilities remained. The culture of practical innovation continued. The connections between universities, factories, and workshops stayed strong. CSIRO became a model that other nations studied carefully. Over the next 30 years, 23 countries created national science organizations based partly on the Australian example. They saw how a relatively small nation had achieved remarkable results by organizing its scientific resources effectively. The key insight was that you did not need the biggest laboratories or the most scientists. You needed the right structure, the right culture, and the willingness to focus on practical problems that really mattered. The methods Australia had developed during the war found new applications. The synthetic rubber techniques led to advanced polymer research. CSIRO scientists would later help develop wrinkle-resistant wool, a discovery that saved Australia's wool industry when synthetic fabrics threatened to replace natural wool in clothing. The radar expertise turned into radio astronomy research. Australia would become a world leader in radio telescope technology, making discoveries about the universe that shocked astronomers everywhere. The optical manufacturing skills evolved into precision, instrument production for scientific research. The acoustic technology from the underwater mines led to sophisticated sonar systems for fishing and marine research. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. Australia had proved something to itself. The nation was not just a farming country. It was not just a supplier of raw materials. Australians could innovate, could invent, could compete with anyone in the world when it came to solving hard problems. That confidence would shape the country's development for generations. Young Australians who saw what the country had accomplished during the war believed that anything was possible with enough determination and creativity. German scientist Kurt Tank learned this lesson the hard way. Tank had designed the FW-190, one of Germany's best fighter planes during the war. After the war, Tank moved to Argentina and later consulted with various governments on aircraft design. In 1950, he visited Australia as part of a trade mission. Someone showed him the aircraft factories near Melbourne, the same facilities that had produced thousands of planes during the war. Tank walked through the workshops, examined the tools and equipment, talked with the engineers who worked there. At the end of the visit, he gave an interview to a local newspaper. His words were striking. "We underestimated Commonwealth innovation capacity by an order of magnitude," Tank said. "An order of magnitude means 10 times larger than expected. This is a profound error in technical assessment. But the more important lesson is this: the Australians weaponized resourcefulness itself. They took the constraint of limited resources and turned it into an advantage. They could not build huge factories like Germany had, so they built many small ones and connected them. They could not import expertise, so they trained their own people quickly and effectively. They could not wait for perfect solutions, so they found good solutions and implemented them immediately. This approach, which we dismissed as crude, proved more effective than our sophisticated methods in many circumstances. Tank's assessment was remarkably honest. He was admitting that German technical superiority, which seemed so obvious before the war, had been partly an illusion. The Germans had more resources and more experience, but they had less flexibility and less creativity when faced with unexpected problems. Australian teams working with far less had achieved results that matched or exceeded German production in several areas. This was not supposed to be possible according to pre-war thinking about industrial capacity and scientific capability. David Rivett received a knighthood in 1945 for his contributions to the war effort. Sir David Rivett, as he became, continued leading CSIRO until 1949. He spent those post-war years fighting to maintain the organization's independence and funding. Politicians who had supported unlimited science spending during the war became more cautious with peacetime budgets. Rivet argued that the investment had to continue. The distributed research network had taken years to build and could collapse quickly if support disappeared. He won most of those battles, ensuring that CSIRO remained strong and effective. Rivet retired in 1949 at the age of 70. He lived another 12 years, watching CSIRO grow and succeed. He gave occasional lectures about the war years, always emphasizing that Australia's success had come from people working together, sharing knowledge, and focusing on practical results rather than theoretical perfection. He avoided taking personal credit, instead praising the hundreds of scientists, engineers, and workers who had turned his vision into reality. When Rivet died in 1961, his obituaries in Australian newspapers gave him proper recognition, but outside Australia, he was largely forgotten. History books about World War II focused on dramatic battles and famous generals. The story of how Australia transformed itself scientifically did not fit the usual narratives. Yet that story contained lessons that proved more and more relevant as decades passed. The post-war world saw many new nations emerging from colonial rule. These nations faced a common question: how do you build scientific and industrial capacity when you start with very little? The traditional answer was to copy what wealthy nations did, building large centralized research institutions and major factories. But this approach often failed. The institutions cost too much to maintain. The factories could not compete with established industrial powers. Many developing nations struggled for decades, never quite catching up. Some nations looked at the Australian example and found a different answer. Israel, gaining independence in 1948, had limited resources and existential threats to its survival. Israeli leaders studied how Australia had mobilized during World War II. They created a similar system of distributed research focused on practical problems. Universities worked directly with military and commercial needs. Small companies formed to turn research into products quickly. The emphasis was on finding solutions that worked rather than on theoretical perfection. Within 30 years, Israel had become a technology leader, punching far above its weight, just as Australia had done. Singapore followed a similar path starting in the 1960s. A tiny city-state with no natural resources, Singapore invested heavily in education and created research institutions tightly connected to practical economic needs. The government encouraged foreign companies to set up operations in Singapore, but insisted they train local workers and share knowledge. This was the same principle Rivet had used: turn constraints into advantages through organization and focus. Singapore became wealthy and technologically sophisticated far faster than most people predicted. South Korea, devastated by war in the 1950s, rebuilt itself partly by studying how smaller nations had achieved rapid technological development. Korean leaders read about the Australian war effort and saw parallels to their own situation: limited resources, external threats, need for rapid advancement. Korea invested in education massively, created research institutions connected to industry, and focused on practical implementation rather than pure theory. By the 1990s, South Korea had become a technological powerhouse, leading the world in areas like electronics and shipbuilding. The pattern repeated again and again. Small or medium-sized nations that focused their scientific resources effectively and kept research connected to practical needs often achieved remarkable results. They proved that innovation was not just about having the most money or the biggest laboratories. Innovation came from solving real problems creatively, from connecting different areas of expertise, from moving quickly from idea to implementation. These were the exact lessons Australia had demonstrated during World War II. The broader conclusion went beyond just science and technology. The Australian experience showed something fundamental about what becomes possible when survival demands innovation. Before the war, experts had calculated what Australia could and could not do. Those calculations were based on reasonable assumptions about population, industrial capacity, and resource availability. The calculations were completely wrong because they left out the most important variable: human adaptability when faced with necessity. When the threat was real enough and the need urgent enough, Australians found ways to do things that seemed impossible. They learned new skills at incredible speed. They created new manufacturing methods. They solved problems that would have taken years in peacetime within months during war. This was not because Australians were somehow special or uniquely talented. It was because the situation gave them no choice but to succeed. Constraints did not limit ingenuity as experts assumed. Constraints concentrated ingenuity, focused it, forced it to find creative solutions that abundance never demanded. Modern examples of this principle appear constantly. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, vaccine developers who normally took 10 years to create new vaccines produced effective versions in less than 1 year. The urgency changed everything. Resources concentrated. Bureaucratic delays disappeared. Teams worked together in new ways. The result was scientific advancement at a pace that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The pandemic proved again what Australia had proved during World War II. Necessity accelerates innovation in ways that comfort never does. The philosophical question at the heart of this story is simple but profound. What else are we capable of that we have not yet been forced to attempt? Human history suggests we consistently underestimate our potential until circumstances demand we exceed it. We assume current limits are permanent until crisis reveals they were temporary. We calculate what seems possible based on past experience until necessity makes us recalculate everything. The German scientists standing in that research center in 1945, reading about Australian achievements, were confronting this truth directly. They had been so certain about what was possible and what was not. Their calculations had been logical and reasonable. Their assumptions had been based on good evidence. And yet, they had been completely wrong about what a nation of 7 million people could accomplish when survival depended on innovation. That is the real lesson Australia taught the world. Not that any one technical solution or organizational structure was best, the lesson was deeper. We do not know what we are capable of until we absolutely have to find out. The most dangerous opponent is not the one with the most resources. The most dangerous opponent is the one who has no choice but to find a way to win. That opponent will innovate in ways the resourceful opponent never imagines. That opponent will discover capabilities that all the experts said did not exist. That opponent will prove the calculations wrong, not by ignoring them, but by changing the fundamental assumptions on which the calculations were based. Australia changed those assumptions. A farming nation became a technological power because the alternative was unacceptable. Limited resources became focused resources. Isolation became the freedom to try new approaches without waiting for approval from distant authorities. Lack of experience became lack of preconceptions about what could not be done. Every disadvantage transformed into an advantage through creativity and determination. That is what the German scientists finally understood as they read through those intelligence reports. They had lost to many things during the war: American industrial might, Soviet numbers, British determination, but they had also lost to something less tangible and more important. They had lost to the power of human adaptability when survival demands innovation. They had lost to the focused creativity that emerges when there is no alternative to success. They had lost to the determination of people who refused to accept that their limitations made victory impossible. The Australian story stands as permanent proof that constraint does not prevent innovation. Constraint concentrates it. The question is not whether we can exceed our current limits. History proves we can. The question is what will finally force us to try. And when that moment comes, what will we discover we were always capable of, but never quite believed was possible? The Germans learned that answer in 1945. The rest of the world has been learning it ever since.